good morning, and welcome to another day covered by the hand of God. Before you step out into whatever this Friday holds, before you get behind the wheel, before you walk into that meeting, before you send your children out the door, heaven wants to remind you of something you may have forgotten in the rush of daily life. You were never meant to walk through this world unprotected. Today is not a day to face uncertain roads, uncertain outcomes, or unseen dangers on your own strength. Today is a day of divine covering, a day to wrap your life, your family, your health, your home, and your future in the protection only God can provide. Somewhere reading this right now, there is a fear that creeps in at the wrong moments, a worry about safety on the road, a concern for a loved one far from home, an unease about what the enemy might be plotting against your peace. I want you to remind yourself that you do not serve a distant God who watches from far away, indifferent to the dangers around you. You serve a God who calls himself your shield, your fortress, your refuge, the one who hides you under the shadow of his wing and sets a hedge of protection around everything that concerns you. So wherever you are, in your car, in your kitchen, on your knees, get ready, because today we are not simply asking God to keep us safe. We are declaring divine protection over every part of our lives, decreeing that no weapon formed against us will prosper, that no danger assigned to our path will succeed, and that every corner of our lives, seen and unseen, is covered by the blood and the promise of God. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and let's step into this covering together, because your safety was secured long before this day began. There is a subtle but significant difference between attributing safety to luck and attributing safety to covenant. And this difference shapes far more than our theology. It shapes the way we move through every single day of our lives. Most people, even those who identify as people of faith, quietly default to a kind of practical belief in luck when it comes to their own safety. They drive to work assuming they will arrive safely because most days they do, not because they have any particular confidence that something is actively guarding them along the way. They send their children to school trusting in probability rather than in promise, comforted by statistics rather than by covenant. This is understandable because luck is easy to believe in. It requires nothing of us. It asks for no relationship, no trust, no ongoing dependence on anything beyond the mathematics of chance. But luck is also fragile because anything built on probability can shift without warning. And a life built on the quiet assumption of good fortune has no real foundation to stand on when the statistics eventually turn against it, as they inevitably do for everyone at some point. Covenant offers something entirely different from luck, because covenant is not a calculation of odds, but a binding relational promise, established not by chance, but by the character and commitment of the one who made it. When protection is understood as covenant rather than coincidence, safety stops being a fragile hope dependent on favorable circumstances and becomes instead a settled confidence rooted in an unchanging relationship. This distinction matters enormously in moments of genuine danger or uncertainty, because a person who believes their safety is merely a matter of luck has nothing solid to stand on when circumstances turn frightening. But a person who understands their safety as covenant has an anchor that does not shift regardless of how threatening the circumstances around them may appear, because covenant does not depend on favorable odds. It depends on a promise that was settled long before the dangerous moment ever arrived. Consider what it actually means for protection to be covenantal rather than coincidental. A coincidence is an unplanned, unintentional alignment of circumstances that happens to work out in our favor. It carries no guarantee of repetition, no binding commitment behind it, no relational foundation ensuring it will continue. Coincidental safety is safety by accident, safety that happened to occur this time but carries no promise of occurring the next time. Covenantal protection is entirely different in nature. It is intentional, deliberate, and rooted in a binding relational commitment that does not depend on circumstances aligning by chance. When God establishes himself as a shield, a fortress, a refuge, he is not describing a pattern of fortunate coincidences that happen to occur around those who trust him. He is describing a covenantal reality, a binding relational promise that he has committed himself to keep regardless of how threatening or dangerous the surrounding circumstances become. This distinction becomes especially important when we consider how differently a person responds to danger depending on which framework they are operating from. Someone who believes their safety has always been a matter of coincidental good fortune tends to respond to danger with a kind of superstitious anxiety, as though their luck might finally run out, as though the streak of fortunate circumstances they have been riding could end at any moment without warning. This produces a low-grade, persistent unease that colors how they approach ordinary activities, driving, traveling, sending loved ones out into the world, because underneath the surface they know their safety has never actually been secured by anything more substantial than probability, and probability offers no promises, only odds that could shift unfavorably at any time. But someone who understands their protection as covenantal responds to danger from an entirely different foundation. They do not deny the reality of danger or pretend that threatening circumstances do not exist. But they approach those circumstances from the settled confidence of someone who knows their safety was never dependent on favorable odds in the first place. It was dependent on a promise, and promises, unlike odds, do not fluctuate based on circumstance. There is something worth examining about why covenant carries this kind of stability that coincidence simply cannot offer. A covenant, by its very definition, is a binding agreement rooted in the character of the party who makes it. When God enters into covenant with his people regarding their protection, he is not making a vague general statement about probability working in their favor. He is making a specific binding commitment rooted in his own unchanging nature. This means the reliability of covenantal protection is not tied to shifting circumstances, fluctuating statistics, or the unpredictable nature of chance. It is tied to the reliability of God's own character, and God's character does not fluctuate. He does not become more or less faithful based on how dangerous the surrounding circumstances happen to be. His commitment to protect those who are his does not weaken during seasons of increased threat or strengthen during seasons of relative calm. It remains constant because it was never dependent on the ebb and flow of external circumstance to begin with. This constancy offers something that coincidental safety could never provide: genuine peace in the midst of genuine danger. If our safety were truly dependent on chance, then danger would rightly produce anxiety, because increased danger would statistically increase the likelihood of harm, and anxiety would simply be an accurate emotional response to accurately assess risk. But if our safety is covenantal, rooted not in the absence of danger, but in a promise that operates independently of how dangerous the circumstances appear, then genuine peace becomes available even in the midst of circumstances that would otherwise warrant significant fear. This does not mean covenant promises the complete absence of difficult or dangerous circumstances. It means covenant promises a covering that operates within, and often despite those circumstances, a protection that does not require danger to disappear in order to remain effective. There is a temptation when discussing covenantal protection to reduce the concept to a kind of magical guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen to those who believe strongly enough or pray fervently enough. This reduction misunderstands the nature of covenant and sets people up for a crisis of faith when difficult things inevitably do happen, as they do in every life, regardless of how much genuine faith a person carries. Covenant protection is not a promise that removes us from the ordinary vulnerabilities of living in a broken world. It is a promise about the ultimate trajectory and purpose of our lives, an assurance that we are held, watched over, and covered even within circumstances that are genuinely dangerous, genuinely uncertain, and sometimes genuinely painful. This is an important nuance because a shallow understanding of protection as an absolute guarantee against all harm often collapses the first time something difficult occurs, leaving people disillusioned and questioning whether the covenant was ever real to begin with. But a mature understanding of covenantal protection holds space for genuine difficulty while still trusting the underlying promise, recognizing that covenant does not mean the absence of every hardship, but the presence of a faithful covering even in the midst of hardship that does occur. This is where the language of shield and fortress becomes particularly instructive, because these images do not suggest an environment free from all threat. A shield exists specifically because there are weapons being aimed at us. A fortress exists specifically because there are forces attempting to breach it. The very language of protection presupposes the existence of genuine danger, genuine opposition, genuine threat. Covenant does not promise a world without these threats. It promises a covering that operates in direct response to them, a shield that stands precisely because there is something to shield against, a fortress that holds precisely because there are forces attempting to break through its walls. This reframing is significant because it allows us to hold both truths simultaneously. Genuine acknowledgement that dangerous, threatening circumstances are a real part of living in this world, combined with genuine confidence that covenantal protection is actively operating within and despite those circumstances. There is also something significant about how covenant differs from coincidence in terms of its relational accessibility. Coincidence, by its nature, cannot be approached, appealed to, or engaged with relationally. You cannot ask coincidence for continued favor, cannot build trust with probability, cannot deepen a relationship with statistical chance. But covenant is inherently relational, which means it can be engaged with actively rather than simply hoped for passively. This is why prayer regarding protection is not merely wishful thinking cast into the void, hoping that circumstances happen to align favorably. It is an active engagement with a covenant partner who has already committed to protection, an ongoing relational conversation that reinforces and activates a promise that already exists, rather than attempting to manufacture a promise that does not yet exist. When we pray for protection, we are not trying to convince a reluctant or uncertain God to consider covering us. We are actively engaging a covenant that has already been established, reminding ourselves of its reality, and positioning ourselves to walk in what has already been promised rather than hoping something might eventually be granted. This relational dimension also means that covenantal protection is not a static, impersonal force operating mechanically regardless of relationship, the way gravity operates regardless of whether we believe in it or acknowledge it. Covenant protection flows out of an actual relationship, which means our posture within that relationship matters. This is not to suggest that protection is earned through perfect behavior or that any lapse in faith immediately voids the covenant. But it does suggest that walking closely within the relationship, actively trusting the one who made the covenant, actively engaging in prayer and declaration regarding that protection, tends to produce a lived experience of security that mere intellectual acknowledgement of the covenant's existence does not automatically provide. There is a difference between knowing intellectually that a covenant of protection exists and actually walking in the confidence, peace, and settled trust that comes from actively engaging that covenant on a daily basis. Understanding protection as covenant rather than coincidence ultimately transforms the entire posture we bring to daily life, particularly to the ordinary moments that carry inherent, if often unacknowledged, risk. Getting into a car, sending a loved one on a journey, walking into an uncertain situation, facing a health concern, navigating an unfamiliar city. All of these ordinary moments carry within them the quiet question of whether we are truly safe, a question most people answer unconsciously by defaulting to a vague trust in probability. But when this question is answered instead through the lens of covenant, the entire texture of daily life shifts. We are no longer moving through the world, hoping that luck continues to favor us. We are moving through the world resting in a binding promise made by a covenant partner whose character does not waver, whose commitment does not fluctuate, and whose protection was established long before any particular danger ever arose to require it. This is the confidence covenant offers that coincidence never could, not the absence of risk, but the presence of a faithful shield standing firm regardless of how much risk surrounds us in any given moment. There is something deeply unsettling about knowing that opposition exists against your life, your family, your purpose, and yet feeling powerless to stop it from forming in the first place. This is one of the most common sources of quiet anxiety that people carry, often without fully articulating it even to themselves. The sense that somewhere forces are working against them, plans are being formed to derail them, weapons of one kind or another are being shaped with the specific intention of causing them harm. This anxiety is not irrational. Opposition is real. Scripture never pretends otherwise, never promises a life free from the formation of weapons aimed against us. But there is a crucial distinction embedded in the promise of protection that deserves careful attention because it does not promise that weapons will never be formed. It promises something far more precise and far more important, that weapons formed against us will not prosper. This distinction between formation and success is the difference between a promise that denies reality and a promise that governs outcomes within reality. And understanding this difference changes everything about how we respond to opposition. Consider what it actually means for a weapon to be formed. Formation implies process, implies intention, implies genuine effort invested by whoever is shaping the weapon in question. Weapons do not form themselves accidentally. They require deliberate construction, purposeful design, and specific intent to cause harm. This means the promise of protection does not begin by denying that people, circumstances, or spiritual forces genuinely intend harm toward us. It begins by acknowledging this reality fully and honestly. There will be people who plot against you. There will be circumstances that seem engineered specifically to derail your progress. There will be spiritual opposition actively working to construct obstacles, accusations, setbacks, and attacks aimed directly at your life and purpose. The promise of protection does not ask us to pretend this formation is not happening. It asks us to trust something far more significant than the mere absence of opposition. It asks us to trust the guaranteed failure of that opposition to actually succeed in its intended purpose. This distinction matters because so much of our anxiety around opposition comes from an unspoken assumption that if a weapon exists, it must eventually succeed. We see the formation happening, we sense the plotting, we recognize the obstacles being constructed against us, and we assume that because these things are real, their success is inevitable. But this assumption reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how the promise actually operates. The promise never suggested that opposition would not exist. It specifically promised that existing opposition would not prosper. This means the formation of a weapon and the success of a weapon are two entirely separate stages, and the gap between these two stages is precisely where divine protection operates most powerfully. The weapon can be fully formed, fully constructed, fully aimed with genuine malicious intent, and still fail entirely to accomplish what it was designed to accomplish, because formation guarantees nothing about outcome. This reframing should fundamentally change how we respond when we become aware of opposition forming against us. The natural human response to recognizing a formed weapon is panic, an assumption that because the threat is real, harm is now inevitable, and the only remaining question is how severe the damage will be. But if we truly understand that formation does not guarantee success, our response can shift from panic to confident resistance. We can acknowledge the reality of the weapon without conceding its victory in advance. We can name the opposition honestly while simultaneously declaring with full confidence that this particular formation, however real and however intentional, will not accomplish what it was designed to accomplish. This is not denial. This is discernment. The ability to distinguish between what is genuinely happening around us and what is genuinely guaranteed to succeed because of it. There is a particular kind of courage required to hold this posture because it demands that we look directly at real opposition without flinching, without minimizing its reality, while simultaneously refusing to grant it the authority to determine our outcome. Many people default to one of two unhealthy extremes when facing opposition. The first extreme is denial, pretending the weapon does not exist, refusing to acknowledge genuine threats out of a desire to avoid fear or discomfort. This extreme leaves people unprepared and naive, vulnerable precisely because they refuse to take seriously what was genuinely forming against them. The second extreme is despair, acknowledging the weapon so fully that its formation is treated as equivalent to its inevitable success, collapsing into fear and hopelessness the moment opposition becomes visible. Neither extreme reflects the actual promise being made. The promise asks for something more nuanced than either denial or despair. Full acknowledgement of the weapon's formation combined with full confidence in its ultimate failure to prosper. This confidence in the weapon's failure is not baseless optimism. It is rooted in a specific understanding of the authority that governs outcomes, even when opposition has genuinely formed. There is a difference between the power to form a weapon and the power to guarantee its success. And this difference exists precisely because there is a higher authority actively intervening in the space between formation and outcome. This is where the entire promise finds its foundation, not in the absence of opposition's power to form weapons, but in the presence of a greater power capable of nullifying whatever those weapons were designed to accomplish. This means our confidence is never rooted in underestimating the opposition. It is rooted in correctly estimating the authority that stands between the opposition's intention and its actual success. There is also something significant about how this promise applies across every category of opposition a person might face, rather than being limited to some narrow definition of what constitutes a genuine threat. Weapons formed against us can take many forms. Physical danger, certainly, but also weapons of accusation, weapons of slander, weapons of financial attack, weapons of relational sabotage, weapons of discouragement and despair aimed specifically at derailing our faith or our purpose. The promise does not specify a narrow category of threat that it applies to while leaving other categories unprotected. It speaks broadly to every weapon, every form, every category of opposition that might be constructed against us, insisting that none of these formations, regardless of their specific shape or target, will be permitted to succeed in their intended purpose. This breadth matters because opposition rarely announces itself clearly as a single identifiable threat. More often, it manifests through a combination of subtle attacks, a sudden financial setback here, an unexpected relational conflict there, a wave of discouragement that seems to arrive from nowhere, an accusation that threatens reputation or standing. These scattered forms of opposition can feel disconnected, random, difficult to identify as coordinated weapons rather than simply the ordinary difficulties of life. But understanding the breadth of the promise allows us to recognize these various forms of difficulty as potentially connected to a broader pattern of formed opposition, and to respond to each of them with the same confident declaration that governs every category of weapon, that regardless of its specific shape, it will not be permitted to prosper. There is a practical dimension to this promise that deserves attention as well, because trusting that weapons will not prosper does not mean abandoning wisdom, discernment, or practical precaution in the face of genuine threat. The promise of ultimate failure does not eliminate the value of prudent action, wise decision-making, or appropriate response to danger. Trusting divine protection has never meant abandoning common sense, ignoring warning signs, or failing to take reasonable precautions against identifiable risk. Rather, the promise operates alongside practical wisdom, providing the confident foundation from which wise action can proceed without being paralyzed by fear. A person who trusts this promise does not become reckless, assuming that because weapons will ultimately fail, no precaution is necessary. Instead, they become clear-headed, able to assess genuine threats accurately and respond wisely, precisely because they are not operating from a place of panic that clouds judgment and produces either paralysis or impulsive overreaction. This clarity of mind is itself one of the practical benefits of trusting this promise deeply. Fear tends to distort perception, making threats seem larger and more insurmountable than they actually are, while simultaneously making our own resources and options seem smaller and more limited than they actually are. This distortion often leads to poor decision-making precisely when clear thinking is most needed. But confidence rooted in the promise that weapons will not prosper tends to produce the opposite effect, a settled clarity that allows accurate assessment of genuine threats without the distorting amplification that fear typically produces. This means trusting the promise is not merely a comforting spiritual sentiment disconnected from practical reality. It is a foundation that actually improves our capacity to respond wisely and effectively to genuine opposition when it does arise. There is also an important declarative dimension to this promise that connects directly to the broader principle of spoken faith shaping outcomes. The promise that weapons will not prosper is not meant to be held only as a private, internal belief. It is meant to be actively declared, spoken aloud over specific situations where opposition has become visible. This declaration serves a similar function to declarations discussed in other areas of faith-filled living. It releases spoken agreement with what has already been promised, actively participating in the process by which the weapons formation is answered with a counter-declaration of its guaranteed failure. When we identify a specific weapon that has formed against us, whether it is a specific accusation, a specific financial threat, a specific relational attack, or a specific assault on our peace of mind, declaring specifically over that situation that it will not prosper is not empty repetition. It is active participation in the very process through which protection operates, refusing to let the weapon's formation go unanswered by the promise that governs its ultimate outcome. Understanding protection through this lens ultimately transforms how we live in a world that will inevitably contain genuine opposition. We stop expecting a life free from weapons being formed against us because such an expectation was never actually promised and sets us up for disillusionment the moment any opposition becomes visible. Instead, we expect exactly what has been promised, the ongoing reality of opposition combined with the guaranteed failure of that opposition to accomplish its intended purpose. This expectation allows us to face genuine threats with clear eyes, honest acknowledgement, and unwavering confidence simultaneously, refusing either to deny the reality of what is forming against us or to grant that formation the premature victory of assuming its inevitable success. The weapon may be real. The intention behind it may be genuinely malicious, but its formation, however real, has never been equivalent to its triumph. And this gap between formation and failure is precisely where the promise of protection does its most powerful and most necessary work. There is a particular kind of loneliness that creeps into moments of danger or uncertainty. A feeling that whatever difficulty we are facing it entirely alone, with no one aware of our circumstances, no one positioned to intervene, no one watching closely enough to step in before harm actually occurs. This feeling of isolation in the face of danger is one of the most common experiences of fear, and it is also one of the most inaccurate because Scripture consistently paints a picture of a world far more populated with unseen assistance than our natural senses could ever perceive. Behind the visible reality we navigate every day, there exists an entire dimension of activity, assignment, and guardianship that operates continuously on our behalf, whether or not we are consciously aware of it in any given moment. This is the promise embedded in the truth that angels are assigned to guard your every step, not a vague, poetic sentiment meant to provide emotional comfort without substance, but a specific active reality describing genuine spiritual assistance actively positioned around your life at all times. Consider what it actually means for a guardian to be assigned rather than simply available on request. Assignment implies a specific deliberate designation, a particular task given to a particular agent with a particular objective in mind. This is not a generic impersonal force floating vaguely in the atmosphere, available to anyone who happens to notice it and request its help. This is specific, targeted assignment, deliberately positioned around a specific individual for the specific purpose of guarding their steps. The language of assignment suggests intentionality, purpose, and precision, indicating that this guardianship is not an accident, not a coincidental byproduct of some larger spiritual system, but a deliberate act of protective care specifically directed toward the person being guarded. This distinction matters because it changes the fundamental posture we bring to our own sense of safety and support. If protection were merely a vague possibility, something that might be available if we happen to pray correctly or believe strongly enough, our confidence would necessarily remain uncertain, tentative, dependent on factors we cannot fully control or verify. But if protection involves specific assignment, deliberate positioning of guardianship around our lives, regardless of our momentary awareness of it, then our confidence can rest on something far more solid than our own fluctuating perception. The angels assigned to guard our steps do not disappear during the moments we forget to acknowledge them, do not become less active during seasons when our faith feels weak, do not require our constant conscious awareness in order to continue fulfilling the assignment they have been given. Their assignment does not depend on our attention to it. It depends on the authority that issued the assignment in the first place. There is something worth examining about the specific language used to describe this guardianship, particularly the phrase concerning every step. This is not protection limited to dramatic, obviously dangerous moments, reserved exclusively for situations of extreme peril while remaining absent during the ordinary rhythms of daily life. The language of every step suggests continuous, comprehensive coverage extending across the entirety of our movement through the world, not just the moments we consciously recognize as dangerous. This means the assignment of guardianship is not something that activates only when we sense danger and deactivates once the danger passes. It is a continuous, ongoing reality operating across every ordinary moment of our lives. The mundane commute, the routine errand, the unremarkable walk from one place to another. Moments we would never think to categorize as requiring supernatural protection precisely because they feel so utterly ordinary. Yet it is often within these very ordinary moments that unexpected danger arises, which is precisely why the promise extends to every step rather than being limited only to moments we would have identified in advance as requiring special guardianship. This comprehensiveness offers a particular kind of peace that a more limited promise could never provide. If protection were only available during moments we correctly identified as dangerous and specifically prayed about in advance, our safety would depend heavily on our own ability to accurately predict which moments actually carried risk, a task at which human beings are notoriously unreliable. We rarely see danger coming with enough clarity to specifically prepare for it in advance. Danger, by its nature, often arrives unexpectedly, in ordinary moments we never flagged as requiring special vigilance. This is precisely why comprehensive guardianship extending across every step, rather than only the steps we consciously identify as risky, provides such genuine security. It does not depend on our own limited discernment to correctly identify which moments require protection. It operates continuously, comprehensively, regardless of whether we recognize the potential danger in advance. There is also something significant about the relationship between this angelic assignment and our own awareness of it, because the effectiveness of this guardianship does not depend on our conscious perception of the angels actively at work around us. This distinguishes genuine spiritual protection from many other forms of comfort that require ongoing conscious engagement in order to remain effective. We do not need to constantly visualize angels, constantly meditate on their presence, or constantly maintain a particular emotional state in order for their assigned protection to remain active. Their activity continues whether we are actively aware of it or completely distracted by the ordinary concerns of daily life. This is important because it means our safety does not depend on maintaining a perfect, unbroken state of spiritual awareness at all times, a standard none of us could realistically sustain. The guardianship operates independently of our moment-to-moment consciousness of it, continuing faithfully even during the countless hours when our attention is entirely absorbed by other concerns. This does not mean our awareness and acknowledgement of this guardianship are irrelevant, however. While the angel's activity does not depend on our perception of it, our own peace, confidence, and freedom from anxiety often does depend significantly on whether we choose to actively remember and trust in this reality. There is a difference between a truth being objectively active regardless of our awareness and that same truth producing its full benefit in our subjective experience. The angels may be guarding our steps whether we remember this truth or not, but our own experience of peace, courage, and settled confidence tends to increase significantly when we actively choose to remember, acknowledge, and trust in this guardianship, rather than allowing it to remain a forgotten, abstract doctrine disconnected from our daily awareness. This suggests a practical discipline worth cultivating. The regular, intentional practice of remembering and acknowledging this angelic assignment, particularly during moments when fear or anxiety about safety begins to rise, rather than allowing fear to operate unchecked, filling the space with worst-case scenarios and imagined dangers, we can actively counter that fear with the specific, deliberate recollection that we are not moving through any given moment unaccompanied. This is not a denial of genuine risk or a naive dismissal of legitimate safety concerns. It is a redirection of our attention toward a reality that is equally true and considerably more relevant to our actual security than the anxious scenarios our imagination tends to generate. Fear typically operates by focusing exclusively on the danger itself, magnifying its severity and probability while ignoring any resources available to counter it. Remembering angelic assignment provides a genuine resource to set against that fear Not a false comfort meant merely to distract from real danger, but an actual spiritual reality that directly addresses the very concern fear is raising. There is also something worth considering about how this guardianship operates not merely reactively, stepping in only after danger has already materialized, but often preventively, working behind the scenes to guide us away from danger before we ever become aware that danger existed at all. Much of angelic guardianship likely operates in ways we never perceive precisely because it succeeds so completely. Dangers averted before they ever became visible to us. Obstacles removed before we ever encountered them. Timing adjusted in ways that kept us from walking into circumstances that would have caused genuine harm. This means the absence of dramatic visible rescue in our own experience does not indicate the absence of guardianship. Quite often, the most significant protective activity happening around our lives is precisely the activity we never see, because its success means we never had to encounter the danger it was working to prevent in the first place. This reframes how we might interpret the countless ordinary days when nothing dramatic happens, when no crisis arises, when our steps proceed uneventfully from morning to evening without incident. Rather than interpreting these uneventful days as simply the absence of any need for protection, we might instead interpret them as evidence of protection working so effectively that its activity remained entirely invisible to us. The quiet, uneventful day is not necessarily a day when guardianship was unnecessary. It may be a day when guardianship succeeded so completely that we never had reason to notice it was needed at all. This perspective shifts gratitude from being reserved only for dramatic rescues we can clearly identify toward a broader gratitude for the countless ordinary days whose very ordinariness may itself be quiet testimony to protection working exactly as assigned. There is also a particular comfort available specifically regarding loved ones who travel far from us, who move through circumstances and environments we cannot personally observe or influence. The anxiety parents feel about children who have moved away, the worry spouses carry about partners traveling for work, the concern we hold for anyone we love who exists beyond the reach of our own direct oversight. All of this anxiety often stems from an assumption that our own physical presence and vigilance is the primary safeguard against harm, and that distance from us, therefore, represents increased vulnerability. But if angelic guardianship extends to every step, rather than being limited to the steps we personally witness, then our physical absence from a loved one's life does not correspond to any reduction in the guardianship actively surrounding them. The same comprehensive assignment that covers our own steps extends to cover theirs, regardless of how far they have traveled from our own watchful presence. This does not mean we should abandon reasonable concern or communication with those we love, but it does mean our anxiety about their safety during our absence can be genuinely tempered by trust in a guardianship that does not depend on our own physical proximity to remain active. Understanding angelic assignment as a specific, continuous, comprehensive reality rather than a vague poetic sentiment ultimately changes the entire emotional texture of how we move through a world that will always contain genuine uncertainty and genuine risk. We are not called to deny that risk exists, nor are we called to develop an unrealistic expectation that nothing difficult will ever happen to us or to those we love. But we are invited into a settled confidence that whatever risk exists, we do not face it as isolated, unaccompanied individuals, left entirely to our own limited resources and awareness. There is assigned guardianship surrounding every step, whether we remember to acknowledge it or not, whether we can perceive its activity or not, whether the danger it addresses is one we ever become consciously aware of, or one that remains permanently invisible precisely because it was successfully averted. This is the quiet, steady confidence available to anyone willing to trust that their steps, in every ordinary and extraordinary moment alike, remain under the continuous watch of guardianship specifically assigned for exactly this purpose. There is a particular image that appears throughout ancient descriptions of protection, an image not of a wall built from stone or a fortress constructed from timber, but of a hedge, a living, growing barrier planted deliberately around something valuable, meant to mark a boundary that unauthorized forces cannot easily cross. This image deserves careful attention because a hedge functions differently than other forms of protective structure. A hedge is not simply a static barrier erected once and left unchanged. It is alive, it grows, it thickens over time, and it surrounds not just a single point, but an entire perimeter, encompassing everything within its boundary rather than merely shielding one particular vulnerable spot. When we speak of a divine hedge surrounding family, home, and health, we are describing exactly this kind of comprehensive living protection, not a narrow shield covering only the most obviously vulnerable target, but a wide, encompassing boundary that surrounds every dimension of what matters most to us. Consider what it means for protection to be comprehensive rather than selective. Many people, when they think about protection, instinctively narrow their focus to whatever feels most immediately threatened in a given season. If health is the primary concern, all prayer and attention gets funneled specifically toward physical well-being, while family relationships and the safety of the home receive comparatively little conscious thought. If family conflict is the dominant concern, health and home safety fade into the background of daily awareness. This selective focus is natural because our attention has limits, and we tend to prioritize whatever feels most urgent in the moment. But the image of a hedge suggests something broader than selective, narrowly targeted protection. A hedge does not protect only the portion of a property that seems most at risk while leaving the rest exposed. It encircles the entire property, providing continuous coverage across every dimension simultaneously, regardless of which particular area happens to feel most urgently threatened at any given moment. This comprehensiveness matters because vulnerability rarely announces itself in advance, clearly identifying which specific area of our lives will require protection on any given day. We might spend months anxiously focused on a health concern, only to discover that the area actually requiring intervention was an unexpected family crisis we never anticipated. We might diligently guard our physical safety while remaining entirely unaware of financial vulnerability building quietly within our household finances. This unpredictability is precisely why comprehensive hedge protection matters so much more than narrow, selectively targeted protection. A hedge surrounding family, home, and health simultaneously does not require us to correctly guess in advance which area will need coverage most urgently. It provides coverage across every dimension at once, so that whatever area does eventually require protection, that protection is already actively present rather than needing to be specifically requested only after the vulnerability has already become apparent. There is something worth exploring about each specific dimension this hedge is described as surrounding, beginning with family, because family represents a category of relationship that carries unique vulnerability precisely because of how deeply we are emotionally invested in the well-being of those closest to us. Threats to our own personal safety, while certainly frightening, often feel more manageable than threats to those we love because we retain at least some sense of control over our own choices and circumstances. But threats to family members, particularly those over whom we have limited direct influence, adult children living their own lives, spouses navigating circumstances beyond our oversight, extended family facing struggles we cannot personally resolve, often produce a particular kind of helplessness that intensifies our anxiety far beyond what we experience regarding our own personal safety. This is precisely why the hedge extending specifically to family matters so significantly. It addresses exactly the category of vulnerability that tends to produce our deepest fear, precisely because it involves people whose safety we cannot directly control ourselves. This coverage extending to family does not mean family members are exempted from ever experiencing hardship, conflict, or difficulty. Just as the broader promise of protection does not mean the complete absence of every difficult circumstance, the hedge around family does not guarantee a life free from relational tension, health struggles among loved ones, or the ordinary challenges that accompany any family navigating life in a broken world. Rather, the hedge represents a boundary against forces that would seek to destroy, permanently fracture, or entirely overwhelm the family unit. A protective coverage against the kind of catastrophic breach that would leave lasting devastation rather than temporary difficulty. This distinction matters because it allows us to hold realistic expectations about the presence of ordinary family struggles while still trusting the deeper promise that these struggles, however real, remain within a hedge that prevents them from developing into the kind of total devastation that forces of destruction would otherwise seek to inflict. Home represents another dimension of this comprehensive hedge, and it is worth considering why home specifically receives this kind of protective attention. Home is more than simply a physical structure providing shelter. It represents the primary space where safety is supposed to be assumed, where rest is supposed to be possible, where the accumulated resources and memories of a family life are gathered together in one place. When home itself feels threatened, whether by literal physical danger, financial instability jeopardizing housing security, or an atmosphere of conflict that makes the home feel unsafe emotionally rather than simply physically, something particularly foundational feels destabilized. Home is meant to be the base from which we operate, the place we return to for restoration after facing the challenges of the wider world. A hedge specifically surrounding home addresses this foundational need, providing coverage not just for the physical structure itself, but for the atmosphere, stability, and security that home is meant to represent. This protective coverage over home extends to dimensions that might not immediately come to mind when we think about safety in a narrow physical sense. It includes protection over the financial stability that keeps a home secure, protection over the relational atmosphere that determines whether home feels like genuine refuge or a source of ongoing stress, protection over the physical structure itself against damage, disaster, or intrusion. Considering home in this comprehensive sense reveals just how many different vulnerabilities this single dimension of the hedge actually addresses, and why trusting divine coverage specifically over the home matters so significantly for anyone who has ever felt that even their own household, the place meant to represent the safest space in their life, was somehow at risk. Health represents the third dimension explicitly named within this comprehensive hedge, and health carries its own particular category of vulnerability, precisely because it involves our own bodies, systems we did not design, cannot fully control, and often do not understand even when we are trying our best to care for them properly. Health concerns produce a unique kind of anxiety because they touch something so fundamental to our daily functioning and so resistant to our own direct manipulation. We can take reasonable precautions regarding our physical well-being, but ultimately the intricate biological systems that keep us alive and functioning operate largely beyond our conscious control or full understanding. This is precisely why divine hedge protection extending specifically to health matters so much. It addresses a category of vulnerability where human control is genuinely limited, providing coverage over a dimension of life where we are, in many respects, most exposed and most dependent on factors beyond our own direct management. This hedge over health does not suggest that illness will never occur or that physical struggle is entirely eliminated from the life of anyone trusting in divine protection. Rather, it suggests a boundary against the kind of catastrophic, destructive assault on health that forces of destruction would otherwise seek to inflict without any restraint. It suggests that even within the reality of physical vulnerability that accompanies living in mortal bodies, there remains a protective boundary, limiting the extent to which illness, disease, or physical harm is permitted to devastate a life that has been specifically covered by this hedge. This does not remove the reality of physical struggle from the human experience, but it does provide a framework of trust within which physical struggle, when it does occur, remains bounded rather than limitless in its capacity to destroy. There is something significant about how this hedge functions not as a passive, inert barrier, but as an active, living boundary that continues to grow and strengthen over time, much like an actual hedge planted in soil, continues to develop deeper roots and thicker foliage the longer it remains established. This suggests that trust in divine protection over family, home, and health is not a static, one-time declaration made once and then forgotten, but an ongoing relationship that deepens and strengthens the more consistently it is cultivated. Just as a hedge requires ongoing care, watering, and attention in order to grow into the thick, effective barrier it is capable of becoming. Our trust in and engagement with divine protective covering over these three dimensions of life tends to produce a deepening sense of security the more consistently we actively nurture that trust through prayer, declaration, an intentional reliance on the promise rather than allowing the promise to remain a distant, abstract doctrine we rarely actively engage. This suggests a practical rhythm worth cultivating specifically around these three named dimensions, regularly, intentionally praying protection and blessing, specifically over family members by name, specifically over the home as both physical structure and relational atmosphere, and specifically over health in both preventive and restorative terms. This kind of specific, targeted prayer does something that vague, general prayers for safety often fail to accomplish. It actively engages the hedge across each distinct dimension rather than leaving the coverage as a vague, undifferentiated concept we rarely think through in specific terms. Naming each family member specifically, naming particular concerns about the home specifically, naming particular health concerns specifically, allows the hedge to be actively engaged with precision rather than remaining a generic, unfocused hope that something, somewhere might be covered. There is also something worth considering about how this comprehensive hedge interacts with our own responsibility to exercise wisdom within each of these three domains. Trusting in divine protective covering over family does not eliminate our own responsibility to nurture healthy family relationships, to communicate wisely, to address conflict rather than ignoring it. Trusting in protective covering over home does not eliminate our responsibility to maintain the physical structure appropriately, to manage finances wisely, to create an atmosphere of peace rather than contributing to conflict. Trusting in protective covering over health does not eliminate our responsibility to make reasonable choices regarding diet, rest, exercise, and appropriate medical care. Rather, divine protection and human responsibility operate together, with our own wise stewardship functioning within and alongside the broader hedge of divine coverage, rather than either factor operating in isolation from the other. This partnership between human responsibility and divine protection reflects a broader pattern seen throughout every dimension of covenant relationship, where trust to divine faithfulness has never been meant to replace human diligence, but rather to provide the secure foundation within which that diligence can be exercised with confidence rather than anxiety. Understanding this comprehensive hedge surrounding family, home, and health ultimately offers a particular kind of rest that narrow, selectively focused anxiety could never provide. Rather than constantly scanning for which specific dimension of life feels most urgently at risk in any given season, shifting our worry from health to family to home and back again in an exhausting cycle of scattered concern, we can rest in the knowledge that all three dimensions are simultaneously covered by the same comprehensive living boundary. This does not eliminate the need for wise attention to each area, nor does it promise the complete absence of difficulty within any of these domains. But it does offer the settled confidence that whatever difficulty does arise within family, home, or health, it arises within a hedge specifically established to prevent the kind of catastrophic, unrestrained devastation that forces of destruction would otherwise seek to inflict without any limitation, providing a framework of trust within which even genuine difficulty can be faced without the paralyzing fear that comes from believing these most precious dimensions of life remain entirely unprotected and exposed. There is a particular test that reveals far more about our actual beliefs than any verbal profession of faith could ever demonstrate, and that test is the presence or absence of peace in the face of uncertainty. We can say with our mouths that we believe in divine protection. We can quote the promises, recite the verses, nod along enthusiastically during a sermon about God as our shield and fortress. But the true measure of whether these words have actually taken root in our hearts is not found in what we say when circumstances are calm and comfortable. It is found in whether genuine, settled peace remains present when circumstances become uncertain, threatening, or frightening. Peace in this sense is not simply a pleasant emotional state to be enjoyed when life happens to be going smoothly. It is evidence, tangible and observable, that the protection we claim to believe in has actually been received and internalized rather than merely acknowledged as an abstract theological concept disconnected from our actual lived experience. Consider the relationships between belief and its physical, emotional manifestation. Genuine belief in something reliable tends to produce a corresponding physiological and emotional response, while belief that remains merely intellectual, unconnected to any real trust, tends to leave the underlying anxiety fully intact regardless of what words are being spoken. This is why a person can recite protective promises with their mouth while their body remains tense. Their mind remains anxious. Their sleep remains disturbed by worry. The words alone do not produce peace. Peace emerges only when those words have moved from mere intellectual acknowledgement into genuine embodied trust. This means peace functions as a kind of diagnostic tool, revealing the actual state of our faith far more accurately than our verbal profession ever could. If we want to know whether we truly believe protection is already active in our lives, we need only examine whether genuine peace accompanies that belief, or whether anxiety continues to operate underneath our spoken words, regardless of how confidently those words are stated. This diagnostic function of peace should not be used as a tool for self-condemnation, however, as though the presence of anxiety automatically indicates a complete absence of genuine faith or a moral failure requiring guilt and shame. Human beings are complex, and even genuine faith often coexists, at least temporarily, with residual anxiety that has not yet been fully released. The presence of some anxiety does not necessarily mean protection has not been received at all. It may simply indicate that the process of internalizing that protection into genuine, settled trust is still ongoing, still developing, still in the process of moving from intellectual acknowledgement toward the kind of deep, embodied peace that fully realized faith eventually produces. This distinction matters because it prevents peace from becoming another performance standard we feel pressured to fake, another area where we condemn ourselves for failing to measure up to some idealized version of what faith should feel like at all times, rather than using the presence of anxiety as evidence of spiritual failure. It is more accurate and more helpful to view anxiety as an invitation, a signal pointing toward an area where trust has not yet fully taken root, an area where the promise of protection has been intellectually acknowledged, but not yet fully internalized into the kind of settled confidence that produces genuine peace. This reframing transforms anxiety from a source of shame into useful information that can guide us toward the specific areas where our trust needs deeper cultivation, where the promise of protection needs to be more deliberately and consistently applied until peace begins to emerge as evidence that the promise has finally moved from abstract concept into lived reality. There is something worth exploring about why peace specifically, rather than some other emotional or spiritual marker, serves as the primary evidence of active protection. Peace occupies a unique position among human emotional states because it cannot be manufactured through willpower alone, cannot be forced into existence through sheer determination, regardless of underlying circumstances. Many emotional states can be at least partially generated through conscious effort. We can force a smile. We can push through exhaustion to display enthusiasm. We can perform confidence even when we do not entirely feel it internally. But genuine peace resists this kind of manufacturing. It cannot be faked convincingly for extended periods because peace is not simply a behavioral display, but a deep internal settledness that either exists or does not exist beneath the surface, regardless of what external performance we attempt to maintain. This is precisely why peace serves as such reliable evidence. Its resistance to manufacturing means that when genuine peace is actually present, it testifies to something real happening beneath the surface, something that could not have been produced through mere willpower or performance alone. This quality of peace being resistant to manufacturing connects directly to why its presence during genuinely uncertain or threatening circumstances carries such particular significance. Peace during comfortable circumstances proves relatively little because circumstances themselves are already providing a natural foundation for feeling settled and secure. Anyone might feel peaceful when nothing threatening is happening, regardless of whether they hold any particular spiritual conviction about protection. But peace that persists specifically during circumstances that would normally produce significant anxiety, a frightening health diagnosis, a dangerous journey, An uncertain financial situation, a threat against family safety. This kind of peace cannot be explained by favorable circumstances because the circumstances themselves are genuinely unfavorable. When peace persists despite circumstances that would normally undermine it, this persistence points towards something beyond the circumstances themselves as the actual source of that peace. And this is precisely where the connection to active divine protection becomes evident. The peace is not explained by the absence of danger. It is explained by trust in a protective covering that operates independently of whether danger happens to be present or absent in any given moment. This distinction between circumstantial peace and covenantal peace deserves careful attention because it clarifies exactly what kind of peace serves as genuine evidence of protection actively at work. Circumstantial peace depends entirely on favorable external conditions and evaporates the moment those conditions shift towards something more threatening. This kind of peace, while pleasant while it lasts, offers no real evidence of anything beyond the temporary absence of visible danger. Covenantal peace operates according to an entirely different mechanism, remaining stable and present specifically because it is rooted not in the absence of danger, but in trust, regarding a promise that operates regardless of danger's presence or absence. This is the peace that surpasses understanding, a peace that observers might find genuinely puzzling, precisely because it does not correspond to what the external circumstances alone would seem to warrant. When someone maintains genuine settledness in the midst of circumstances that would reasonably produce significant fear in most people, this incongruity itself becomes a form of testimony, evidence visible not just to the person experiencing that peace internally, but to others observing it from the outside. Evidence that something beyond ordinary circumstantial calculation is actively operating to produce that unusual stability. There is also something significant about how cultivating this kind of peace requires active practice rather than simply waiting passively for it to arrive on its own. Peace, particularly the kind of deep, settled peace that persists through genuine uncertainty, is rarely something that simply happens to us without any intentional cultivation on our part. It tends to develop through consistent practices that reinforce trust. Regular prayer specifically addressing areas of anxiety, regular declaration of the specific promises of protection relevant to whatever uncertain circumstance is being faced, regular reflection on past experiences where trust proved reliable, building a track record of evidence that reinforces confidence for present and future circumstances. This active cultivation matters because peace that has been consistently practiced tends to prove more resilient during genuine crisis than peace that has never been actively developed through regular spiritual discipline. A person who has spent years cultivating trust through consistent practice tends to have deeper reserves to draw upon when a genuinely frightening circumstance arises, compared to someone attempting to manufacture peace for the very first time in the middle of an acute crisis with no prior foundation of practiced trust to draw upon. This suggests that the pursuit of peace as evidence of active protection is not something to be addressed only during moments of crisis, scrambling to achieve settledness only after danger has already become apparent. It is something to be cultivated consistently during calm seasons as well, building the kind of deep practiced trust that will naturally sustain peace when circumstances eventually shift towards something more threatening, as they inevitably will at various points throughout any life. The calm seasons are not simply neutral periods to be passed through without particular spiritual significance. They are training seasons, opportunities to build and reinforce the kind of settled trust that will prove essential once circumstances become genuinely difficult. Neglecting this cultivation during calm seasons, assuming peace will simply be available whenever it is eventually needed without any prior practice, often leaves people unprepared for the genuine test that difficult circumstances inevitably bring. There is also an important relational dimension to this peace, because peace as evidence of protection is not meant to be experienced in isolation, but shared, communicated, and reinforced within community. When individuals within a community of faith regularly testify to peace they have experienced during genuinely difficult circumstances, This testimony serves a significant function for others within that community who may currently be struggling to access similar peace in their own uncertain situations. Hearing genuine testimony of peace maintained through genuine difficulty provides both encouragement and practical demonstration that this kind of peace is actually achievable, not merely a theoretical concept discussed abstractly, but a lived reality experienced by real people navigating real uncertainty. This communal reinforcement matters because peace, while ultimately an internal reality, tends to be strengthened through connection with others who can testify to its reliability, who can pray alongside us during our own seasons of struggle, who can remind us of the promise when our own capacity to remember it independently feels weakened by the intensity of whatever circumstance we happen to be facing. Ultimately, understanding peace as evidence that protection is already active reframes the entire pursuit of settledness in the midst of uncertainty. Rather than treating peace as simply a pleasant emotional bonus we hope to experience if circumstances happen to cooperate, we begin to understand peace as a meaningful signal, a piece of genuine evidence testifying to the reality of protective covering operating in our lives, regardless of how threatening our present circumstances may currently appear. This does not mean anxiety, when it does arise, should be treated as evidence of spiritual failure or grounds for self-condemnation. It means anxiety can instead be treated as useful information, pointing toward areas where trust has not yet fully matured into settled peace, inviting us toward deeper cultivation of the very trust that will eventually produce the peace we are seeking. And when genuine peace does emerge, particularly during circumstances that would otherwise warrant significant fear, this peace becomes something far more substantial than simply a pleasant feeling to be enjoyed. It becomes living proof, tangible and undeniable, that the protection we have been declaring, praying, and trusting in has moved beyond mere words into genuine active reality, quietly but unmistakably confirming that we are, in this very moment, already covered.